fill a critical national need like infrastructure projects. The plan would incentivize the most effective public-private partnerships involving businesses, universities, foundations. Funding would come from money the U.S. currently spends on economic development. Governor, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us.
You bet. Thanks for having me on, Allie.
The plan sounds great. Let's talk details. How do you ensure that we undertake projects using private and public money that do create jobs and fix problems, as opposed to the accusation that we get from a lot of conservatives that say these things are just pork?
Well, first of all, in states, it's happening all the time anyway. Every state almost has an economic development agency that has identified that state's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, a SWOT analysis, if you will, and they've decided to focus on areas of strength inside of that state's geographic borders. So what I'm suggesting is to put that kind of effort on steroids, knowing that our economic competitors are not state to state, but of course state to country. What are other countries doing? They're luring our businesses because they're being aggressive. So I want to see that happen. Now the question is, how do you make sure that it's effective?
Yeah.
You want to make sure that the government's dollar is the last dollar in, or that if it's a tax incentive, which is really a but-for kind of incentive, you're not going to be paying out money directly. It's money that would be foregone if there is economic development inside the state. So the bottom line is, it can be done. It's being done on state level right now. But if the federal government came in as a partner on this, then it would really enhance our ability to attract and create economic clusters inside the state.
And I've advocated that on this show, and the idea of an infrastructure bank. But the criticism is pretty consistent from people who say, why is the government involved? Your plan is incentivize public-private partnerships. A lot of people say that these projects don't create value on the taxpayer side, on the government side. One example that's gotten a lot of attention is in Chicago. In 2008, a partnership paid the city $1.15 billion for 75 years' worth of parking meter revenues, and since then, parking rates have gone up. The partnership is expected to turn a huge profit. The group bills the city every time a parking space is taken out of service, and Rahm Emanuel is pushing back, saying he's not paying the penalties. I know it's just one example, but how do you answer the critics who can find flaw in every one of these public-private partnerships?
Well, I mean, certainly you have to craft it in a way that provides value for the citizens, and jobs is one way of looking at that, but you don't want to cause the citizens to have to pay huge amount of other dollars in fees, in additional parking and taxation. That's why they've got to be crafted in a smart way. And it's not always just an infrastructure project. It might be some kind of not traditional infrastructure. You might decide that as a nation we want to really invest in the grid, for example. And so how do you make that happen? Well, partnering with the private sector, everybody has a role. And if you don't have the government as a player to do the things that government can do well, then you are basically forfeiting the race to other countries that are very aggressively partnering. So if you have a cluster that has both the university as a partner, as well as foundations as a partner of the government, and certainly the private sector leading the way, why wouldn't you do that if it means jobs for your state?
4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, America got into a recession that you in Michigan were very familiar with. You have seen cities that
look like front of it.
So you want to invest in people. You call it soft infrastructure, but it's human resources, it's people. You want to build a workforce that is competitive internationally, and one of the things you write is that we should learn from Germany and subsidize employment rather than unemployment. What is it about the German model that you're interested in?
Yeah, the German model is called Kurzarbeit, and in tough economic times and when things are slow, especially in this manufacturing sector, instead of seeing full layoffs, what they do is the employees take a part-time position with that same company, but their salary is supplemented by the government, and that way you don't have the private sector laying people off, paying more money to having less employees. They want to keep these employees. They're just in a down cycle. So they part-time employ them. That's where you don't have the government supporting people who are unemployed. You have the government helping to finance the employment of people. And I would say one other thing, too, that Germany has done very well, which is to really focus on training young people for technical skills. And I think, in Michigan, we did something called No Worker Left Behind, where we deployed community colleges colleges in partnership with the private sector and the skills that they need, so that when somebody is done with being on unemployment, they come out and they have a job in an area where there's a skills gap that's been filled by their
So
training.
this would take the decision from being binary away from companies, either on and hired or off and fired. That you're giving companies leeway in the middle to say we can keep these employees on if you give them a little extra. It's an interesting idea, but let's talk about a different one. Multinational corporations have about $1.7 trillion in offshore holdings, and you want to do something interesting. You're suggesting lowering the corporate tax rate on a one-time basis to allow companies to repatriate that money back to the United States, and then use the tax revenue from there to fund this infrastructure bank. So we're coming full circle here. Funding the bank is half the battle, and I think that's an idea that can gain a lot of steam. How do you make sure you're finding the right projects? What do you use as a criteria to find projects that are funded by an infrastructure bank?
Well, first of all, I don't think you have Congress decide projects on a pork barrel piece-by-piece basis. I think you have Congress set the parameters, and there's some great suggestions out there about how an infrastructure bank could be constructed. But I do think that part of that money that's repatriated could go to investing in maintenance of existing traditional infrastructure, and part of it investing in the future type of infrastructure, like grid infrastructure, like clean energy infrastructure, or even human infrastructure. But the bottom line is we have to get the financing to do that, and you've got all of this money offshore. Why not provide a one-time incentive for it to be brought back, but not just to go back into the company's coffers, not just go back in traditional tax, without seeing a benefit. Direct it specifically toward an infrastructure bank that could be crafted in a way that creates jobs and is future-looking.
Senator Granholm, pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us. And by the way, did that work out, that whole dating game thing?
I cannot believe you started with that. I was doing so well, and you completely destroyed my credibility. All right, I was 19 years old, and let this be a warning to all you young people out there. There is stuff that lasts on video for a long time. It was a bad hair day.
Right, when we were 19, we didn't think that happened. Now you know it's all on YouTube. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Governor Jennifer Granholm is a host of The War Room on Current TV, former governor of Michigan, and the author of A Governor's Story, The Fight for Jobs and America's Economic Future. Coming up, America's Cities.